October 15th, 2024. Margaret Holloway had taught at Lincoln High for 17 years. She knew which students carried knives, which ones hadn't eaten lunch in days, and which ones wouldn't make it to graduation. She didn't know that 3 of them had been planning her kidnapping for 6 months. At 4:47 p.m., as Margaret erased equations from her whiteboard, Darius locked the classroom door. Jasmine pulled the blinds. Marcus produced the zip ties from his backpack, the same backpack she'd helped him get through the school's charity program. "Please don't scream, Mrs. H," Darius said, his voice breaking. "We don't want to hurt you." What happened in that classroom would unravel 3 years of carefully buried secrets. It would expose a truth about Margaret's son that Detroit police had covered up, and it would prove that sometimes the people we're trying to save are the ones who need to save us. The day Margaret Holloway learned that teaching someone doesn't mean you know them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret's hands trembled as she set down the eraser. The whiteboard behind her bore smudges where algebraic equations had lived moments before, simple problems with clean solutions, unlike everything happening in this room right now. Darius. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Whatever this is about, we can talk through it." The 17-year-old shifted his weight, avoiding her eyes. In 2 years of having him in her remedial English classes, she'd watched him struggle with paragraph structure, but never struggle with kindness. He'd been the one who helped her carry boxes to her car last December when her back went out. The one who asked how she was doing on the anniversary of Danny's death, even though she'd never told her students about losing her son. "Put your hands behind your back, Mrs. H." Jasmine's voice was harder than Darius's, but Margaret caught the tremor underneath. The girl had grown up 3 blocks from here, in a house where the electricity got cut off more than it stayed on. Margaret had kept granola bars in her desk drawer specifically for Jasmine, who'd perfected the art of pretending she wasn't hungry. "Jazz, honey, don't." Jasmine stepped closer, and Margaret could see the fear swimming in her dark eyes. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Marcus moved behind Margaret's desk, still silent. At 16, he was the youngest of the 3, and the one who worried her most. Too thin, too quiet, with bruises that appeared on Mondays and faded by Fridays. The backpack he'd pulled the zip ties from was navy blue with reflective strips. She'd filled out the paperwork herself when he'd qualified for emergency school supplies. The late afternoon sun slanted through the blinds Jasmine had drawn, casting prison bar shadows across the worn linoleum. Room 237 had been Margaret's domain for 8 years, ever since the budget cuts moved her from the main English department to remedial classes. She'd hung motivational posters over the water stains and brought in her own books to fill the empty shelves. This was supposed to be a safe space. "The zip ties aren't necessary," Margaret said, keeping her voice calm. In 17 years of teaching, she'd talked kids down from worse than this. At least, she thought she had. "Tell me what you need." Darius finally looked at her, and she saw something that made her chest tighten. Desperation, yes, but underneath it, hope, as if she could fix whatever had brought them to this point. "We need money, Mrs. H, real money." "How much?" $50,000. The number hit her like cold water. Margaret's teacher salary was $47,000 a year, and that was after 17 years in the district. Her savings account held $3,200, and half of that was earmarked for the new water heater she'd been putting off since summer. "I don't have that kind of money." "But your husband does," Jasmine said. "We looked him up. Paul Holloway, senior accountant at Brennan and Associates. That's good money." Margaret's stomach dropped. Paul had left her 2 years ago, 6 months after Danny's funeral. She'd never told her students about the divorce, never mentioned that she'd moved from their Grosse Pointe house to a 1-bedroom apartment in Rivertown, never explained why she'd started staying at school until 6 every night, because going home to an empty apartment felt like drowning. "You don't understand." "We understand plenty," Marcus spoke for the first time, his voice carrying an edge that raised the hair on Margaret's arms. "We understand about people who got money and people who don't, about people who get choices and people who get whatever's left. There was something in his tone that reminded her of Danny in those final months. That anger that had nowhere to go. That sense of being trapped in a life that felt predetermined. She'd watched her son pace their kitchen at midnight, ranting about how nothing he did mattered, how the whole system was rigged to keep certain people down while others got to pretend they'd earned their advantages. "Sit down," Mrs. H. Darius gestured to the student desk in the front row, the one with the broken arm that wobbled whenever someone leaned on it. As Margaret moved toward the desk, her mind raced through possibilities. The school would be mostly empty by now. Custodial staff worked the other wing first, wouldn't reach this hallway until after 6. Her phone was in her purse, locked in her desk drawer. The panic button by the door was the kind that only worked if you could reach it. But looking at these 3 kids, her kids, because that's how she'd thought of them for 2 years, she wondered if she wanted to reach it. "Before we go any further," Margaret said, settling into the too small desk chair, "I need to know something. Are you doing this because you're scared or because someone told you to?" The question hung in the dusty air between them, and in the silence that followed, Margaret heard the first whisper of something that would shatter everything she thought she knew about her son's death. The silence stretched like a held breath. Margaret watched as something passed between the 3 students, a look she couldn't quite decipher, but one that made her chest tighten with recognition. It was the same look Danny used to exchange with his friend Kevin when they thought she wasn't paying attention, back when her son had started coming home with expensive sneakers and vague explanations about helping a friend with deliveries. "Both," Darius finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's hands folded in her lap, fingers tracing the wedding ring she still wore out of habit. 2 years of sleeping alone, of making dinner for one, of sitting in parent-teacher conferences for other people's children while her own lay buried in Woodlawn Cemetery. The grief counselor had told her that losing a child was like learning to live with a phantom limb. You'd always reach for something that wasn't there anymore. She studied their faces in the amber light filtering through the blinds. Jasmine gnawed at her bottom lip, a nervous habit Margaret had noticed during essay tests. Marcus stood rigid by the window, but his hands shook slightly. And Darius, sweet, thoughtful Darius, who'd once written a poem about his grandmother's hands, looked like he might vomit. "Scared of what?" Margaret asked gently. "You wouldn't understand," Jasmine said, but there was no conviction in it. "People like you don't—" "People like me?" Margaret's laugh held no humor. "Honey, you think because I stand in front of this classroom that I don't know about being afraid? About making choices that keep you awake at night?" She thought about the last conversation she'd had with Danny. 3 years ago next month, standing in their kitchen while he'd wolfed down leftover lasagna before heading out again. She'd asked where he was going. He'd kissed her cheek and said, "Don't worry, Mom, I'm figuring it out." 6 hours later, the police had found his body behind the abandoned Coney Island on 8 Mile. "My son died 3 blocks from here," Margaret said quietly. The words still tasted like broken glass. Daniel Holloway, Danny. He was 19. The change in the room was immediate. Marcus turned from the window, his expression shifting from defiance to something softer. Jasmine's hand dropped to her side. Darius took a step backward, as if her words had physically pushed him. "The kid who—" Marcus started, then stopped himself. "What?" Margaret's pulse quickened. "What were you going to say?" But Marcus had gone silent again, his jaw clenched tight. The afternoon shadows were growing longer, stretching across the motivational posters Margaret had hung to convince herself she was making a difference. "Reach for the stars. Your future starts today." Empty platitudes that felt increasingly hollow with each passing year of watching bright kids like these get swallowed by circumstances beyond their control. Margaret rose from the desk chair, moving slowly so as not to startle them. "If you know something about my son—" "We don't know nothing," Jasmine said quickly, but her eyes darted toward Marcus. "That was before we knew you, before we came to Lincoln." The lie sat heavy in the air between them. Margaret had been teaching at Lincoln for 8 years. These 3 had been her students for 2. The math didn't add up, but then again, nothing about today did. She walked to the window, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway beyond. Outside, Detroit's east side sprawled in varying shades of decay and resilience. Boarded-up houses stood next to neat gardens tended by grandmothers who refused to give up. Chain link fences wrapped around lots where children played on rusted swing sets. This was Danny's neighborhood too, the one he'd been trying to leave behind when he'd started running with the wrong crowd. "You know what I remember about my son?" Margaret said, her breath fogging the glass. "How he used to bring home strays, dogs, cats, once even a pigeon with a broken wing. He couldn't stand to see something hurting." She turned back to face them. He also couldn't stand feeling helpless. Toward the end, he was so angry about everything he couldn't fix. The poverty, the violence, the way some kids got college prep classes while others got tracked into remedial everything. He wanted to do something big, something that mattered. Darius shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. H." He started making money, more than he could earn at his part-time job at the grocery store. When I asked about it, he said he was helping people. Said someone had to level the playing field. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. Margaret could smell the chalk dust and industrial cleaner, the lingering traces of adolescent anxiety and cheap cologne. But underneath it all, she caught something else, the metallic scent of fear. 3 days before he died, she continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Danny told me he'd made a mistake. Said he'd gotten in too deep with the wrong people, but he was going to make it right." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus dropped the zip ties. The plastic clattered against the linoleum like breaking bones, and in that sound, Margaret heard the echo of the phone call that had changed everything 3 years ago. The one that came at 2:47 a.m. Detective Rodriguez's voice careful and professional as he told her they'd found her son behind an abandoned restaurant with 2 bullets in his chest. "Mrs. H." Darius's voice cracked. "You knew him." It wasn't a question anymore. Margaret's hands were steady now, the tremor gone, replaced by something cold and sharp. "You knew Danny." Jasmine stepped backward until her shoulders hit the bulletin board, sending student essays fluttering to the floor. "We can't." "You can't what?" The words came out harder than Margaret intended. "You can't tell me the truth about my son? About why he's dead?" Marcus was staring at his feet, but she caught the way his jaw worked, like he was chewing words he couldn't swallow. The afternoon light had shifted, casting deeper shadows across his face, and for a moment Margaret saw someone else entirely. A boy who'd stood on her porch one October evening, asking if Danny was home. A boy she'd offered hot chocolate to while they waited for her son to finish his homework. "You came to the house," she whispered, "before he died. I remember you." The blood drained from Marcus's face. "That wasn't. I didn't." "You were smaller then. Younger. You said you were in Danny's study group." Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But Danny wasn't failing any classes. He was getting ready to apply to Wayne State. The silence stretched taut as a wire. Outside, a car alarm wailed and cut off abruptly. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed. Normal sounds of a world continuing to spin while Margaret's came apart for the second time in 3 years. "The police said it was gang-related," she continued, her mind racing through fragments of memory she'd buried. Random violence, wrong place, wrong time. But that wasn't true, was it? Darius made a sound like a wounded animal. "We were kids." "You were kids who knew something." Margaret turned to face them fully, and something in her expression made Jasmine flinch. "All this time, I've been teaching you, caring about you, keeping granola bars in my desk for when you didn't have lunch money. And you knew." The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret thought about the nights she'd stayed awake, wondering what Danny's last moments had been like, whether he'd been scared, whether he'd thought about her. The grief counselor had told her those questions would fade with time, but they hadn't. They'd burrowed deeper, becoming part of her DNA. "It wasn't supposed to happen," Marcus said suddenly, his voice raw. "None of it was supposed to happen like that." "What wasn't supposed to happen?" Margaret stepped toward him, and he flinched but didn't move away. "Tell me what my son got mixed up in. Tell me why he died." "Because he tried to get out." The words exploded from Jasmine like she couldn't hold them back anymore. "Because he wanted to stop, and they don't let people stop." The room tilted. Margaret gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles white. "They..." "Mrs. H, please..." Darius reached toward her, then stopped himself. "You don't understand how deep this goes. How many people..." "I understand that my son is dead." The words tore from Margaret's throat. I understand that for 3 years I've been living with questions that eat me alive every night. And I understand that you three know something about what really happened to him. She looked at each of them in turn, seeing them clearly for the first time. Not as struggling students who needed her help, but as pieces of a puzzle she'd been trying to solve since the morning she'd identified Danny's body at the morgue. The $50,000, she said slowly. It's not for escape money, is it? Marcus closed his eyes. Mrs. Shh. It's connected to Danny, to what happened to him. Margaret's voice was deadly quiet now. That's why you came to me. Not because you looked up my ex-husband's job, because you know exactly who I am. The last piece clicked into place with an almost audible snap, and Margaret felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The careful equilibrium she'd built over 3 years of grief and guilt and unanswered questions crumbled like a house of cards. She'd been teaching her son's killers. The thought struck her with crystalline clarity, and she had to grip the desk harder to keep from falling. These 3 children she'd worried about, cared for, lost sleep over, they were connected to the violence that had torn her world apart. How long have you known who I was? Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. The silence that followed told her everything she needed to know. There was no going back from this moment. No returning to the careful routine of lesson plans and graded essays and pretending that teaching remedial English was enough to fill the Danny-shaped hole in her life. Everything had changed. Everything had been a lie. The question hung between them like a blade, and Margaret watched as the 3 students seemed to shrink before her eyes. Not physically. They were still the same teenagers who'd cornered her 20 minutes ago, but something essential had collapsed in their postures. The defiance, the desperate bravado, even the fear. All of it had given way to something that looked almost like relief. Since the beginning, Darius whispered. We've known since the beginning. Margaret's legs gave out. She sank into her desk chair, the familiar squeak of worn springs a mockery of normalcy. 2 years. 2 years of parent-teacher conferences where she'd advocated for them, of staying late to help with essays, of worrying about their futures like they were her own children. Get out. The words came out hoarse. All of you. Get out of my classroom. But even as she said it, she knew she didn't mean it, couldn't mean it. Because these 3 kids, these lying, manipulative kids who'd pretended to care about her while carrying the weight of her son's death, were the only link she had to the truth. Mrs. H., please. Jasmine started. Don't. Margaret held up a hand, surprised by how steady it looked. Don't you dare call me that. Not anymore. Marcus moved toward the door, then stopped. If we leave now, you'll never see us again. It was a threat disguised as a fact, and they all knew it. Margaret stared at him, at this boy she'd watched struggle through basic grammar exercises, and wondered how she'd missed it, the calculation behind his quiet demeanor. The way he always seemed to know more than he let on. And if I call the police? She asked. You won't. Darius's voice was flat, certain. Because you need answers more than you need justice. The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. For 3 years, she'd existed in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of living while the questions about Danny's death consumed her from the inside. The official story had never made sense. Her son walking alone behind that abandoned Coney Island at midnight, getting caught in some random act of violence. Danny had been smart, careful. He wouldn't have put himself in that position unless he was meeting someone, she said aloud. The change in the room was immediate. Marcus froze halfway to the door. Jasmine's sharp intake of breath was audible. Even Darius, who'd been trying to project confidence, looked stricken. Margaret stood slowly, her mind working through possibilities she'd been afraid to consider for 3 years. He was meeting someone he trusted, someone he thought he could reason with. Mrs. Holloway. Marcus's use of her formal name felt like another small death. You're going down a road you can't come back from. I've been on that road since the night my son died. Margaret moved toward the window, looking out at the street where Danny had grown up, where he'd learned to ride a bike and throw a football and dream about a future that had been stolen from him. The only question is whether I'm going to keep walking it alone. She turned back to face them, and something in her expression made Jasmine take an involuntary step backward. You came here today asking for $50,000, money you knew I didn't have, money you knew my ex-husband wouldn't give me even if I asked. Margaret's voice grew quieter, more dangerous. So what's the real plan? What did you really come here for? The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Outside, the sounds of the neighborhood continued, children calling to each other, cars passing, the distant rumble of the bus line that would take these kids back to whatever homes they came from. Normal life, carrying on as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. Information, Darius finally said. We came here for information. About what? About what Danny told you before he died. Marcus's voice was barely audible. About what he might have given you. Hidden somewhere. Margaret felt the walls of the classroom pressing in. Given me? Danny didn't give me anything except promises that he was going to make everything right. But even as she said it, fragments of memory surfaced. Danny's last visit home, how he'd spent an hour in his old bedroom going through things he'd left behind. How he'd taken some of his childhood books, novels she'd read to him when he was small, and loaded them into his car. She'd assumed it was nostalgia, a young man reconnecting with simpler times. The books, she whispered. The effect was immediate. All three students went rigid, and Margaret knew with cold certainty that she'd stumbled onto something vital, something that had kept these kids circling her for 2 years, building trust, waiting for the right moment to strike, something that might finally explain why her son had died. What books? Darius's voice was sharp, cutting through the classroom air like a blade. The casual facade he'd maintained for 2 years had crumbled completely, replaced by something predatory and desperate. Margaret took a step back, her hip bumping against the desk. The sudden shift in his demeanor sent ice through her veins. This wasn't the struggling student who'd asked for help with his essays about overcoming adversity. This was someone else entirely, someone who'd been wearing Darius's face like a mask. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but the lie felt transparent even to her. Yes, you do. Marcus moved away from the door, and Margaret realized with growing alarm that the three of them had positioned themselves in a triangle around her. Whether consciously or not, they'd blocked her exits. Danny told someone he was keeping records. Insurance, he called it. The word hit Margaret like a slap. Insurance. She remembered now. Danny pacing their kitchen 3 days before he died, his phone buzzing constantly with messages he wouldn't answer. He'd been agitated, scared in a way she'd never seen before. When she'd pressed him about it, he'd said something about making sure people knew the truth if anything happened to him. She'd assumed he was being dramatic. 19-year-olds thought everything was life or death. Records of what? The question escaped before she could stop it. Names, dates, who was paying who? Jasmine's voice had taken on the same hard edge. Danny was smart, Mrs. H too smart for his own good. He kept track of everything. Margaret's mouth went dry. You're talking about drug money, protection payments. Which cops looked the other way and which politicians got their campaigns funded. Marcus's words came faster now, like a dam had burst. Your son wasn't just some low-level dealer. He was bookkeeper for half the East Side. The classroom spun. Margaret gripped the desk harder, her knuckles white against the wood grain. All those nights she'd lain awake wondering how Danny had gotten involved with drugs, she'd pictured him as a victim. A good kid who'd made one bad choice and paid for it with his life. But this painted a different picture entirely. Danny as a willing participant, someone who'd chosen to document the corruption eating away at their neighborhood. Someone who'd held enough dangerous information to make himself a target. He was trying to bring people down, she whispered. He was trying to get himself killed, Darius snapped. And he succeeded. The cruelty in his voice was like a physical blow. Margaret stared at him. This boy she'd worried about when he missed class, who she'd given her lunch to when she'd noticed him going without food. The same boy who was now talking about her dead son with the casual callousness of someone discussing the weather. You knew all this when you enrolled at Lincoln, she said, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. You came here specifically to find me. We came here specifically to survive. Jasmine's voice cracked on the last word. You think we wanted to spend 2 years pretending to give a shit about grammar lessons? Pretending to care about your stupid motivational posters and your granola bars? Each word was a knife between Margaret's ribs. 2 years of what she thought was genuine connection, reduced to performance art. 2 years of believing she was making a difference in these kids' lives, when really she'd been nothing more than a mark. The people Danny was keeping records on, Margaret said slowly. They're still out there, some of them. Marcus's laugh held no humor. The ones who didn't get arrested when his information went to the FBI. What? Margaret's legs nearly gave out again. The FBI? Your son was building a case, Mrs. Holloway. Darius's use of her formal name felt like another small cruelty. Working with federal agents to take down a network that stretched from street dealers all the way up to city council. He was supposed to testify. The room tilted on its axis. Margaret reached out blindly, her hand finding the edge of her desk. Testified. Danny had been cooperating with federal law enforcement, and she'd never known, never suspected. But he got cold feet, Jasmine continued, her voice flat and merciless. Started having second thoughts about burning down his whole neighborhood. So he tried to back out, and they killed him for it, Margaret whispered. They killed him because he was a liability. Marcus moved closer, and Margaret could smell the fear sweat on his clothes. Because even if he didn't testify, he still had enough information to destroy lives, and that information didn't die with him. The books. Danny's childhood books that he'd taken from his room that last day. Margaret's vision grayed at the edges as the full horror of the situation crashed over her. Her son hadn't just been a victim of street violence. He'd been executed by people who were still out there, still dangerous, and somehow she'd been teaching their children. Who are you? The question came out as barely more than breath. Who are you really? The 3 students exchanged glances, and in that moment of silent communication, Margaret saw the truth. These weren't random kids from broken homes. They were connected to Danny's death in ways that went far deeper than she'd imagined. The silence stretched until Darius finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of a confession that would change everything. We're the children of the people your son was going to destroy. The words hung in the air like poison gas, and Margaret felt something fundamental break inside her chest, not her heart that had shattered 3 years ago in a hospital corridor. This was something deeper, more essential, the careful framework of reality she'd built around Danny's death, around her purpose as a teacher, around the meaning she'd tried to extract from senseless tragedy. Children, she repeated, the word tasting like ash. Her gaze moved from face to face, seeing them clearly for the first time. The inherited angles of jaw lines, the familiar gestures she'd attributed to shared neighborhood mannerisms. Whose children? Darius straightened, and in that movement Margaret saw an echo of someone else, someone who'd stood in her doorway years ago, asking politely if Danny was available for a study session that had never made sense because Danny had never mentioned these kids as friends. Vincent Torres, Darius said. My father ran the distribution network from 8 Mile to Jefferson. Danny had 2 years' worth of transaction records, every pickup, every drop, every payoff. Margaret's vision blurred at the edges. She remembered Vincent Torres from the newspapers after Danny's death, a person of interest who'd been questioned and released, a man whose lawyer had provided an airtight alibi while his 19-year-old son had apparently been sitting in Margaret's remedial English class, pretending to struggle with essay structure. Jasmine? Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. Detective Raymond Cole. My dad made sure certain evidence got lost, certain witnesses forgot what they saw. Jasmine's hands were shaking now, the first crack in her armor. Danny had photographs, recordings. Detective Cole. Margaret remembered him from the investigation, a tired-looking man who'd taken her statement with what she'd interpreted as compassion, who'd told her that sometimes there were no answers, that some cases went cold despite everyone's best efforts, who'd sat in her living room and accepted her coffee while knowing exactly why her son was dead. Her gaze shifted to Marcus, and she already knew what he was going to say before he opened his mouth. City Councilman Michael Washington, Marcus whispered. My father took campaign contributions from people who shouldn't exist on paper. Danny documented every payment, every favor, every time Dad voted to cut police funding in specific neighborhoods. The betrayal was so complete, so perfectly orchestrated, that Margaret actually laughed. The sound came out broken and bitter, echoing off the classroom walls covered with motivational posters about perseverance and hope. 3 years of teaching these children. 3 years of seeing potential in their eyes, of staying late to help with homework, of fighting the administration for resources to support struggling students. 3 years of nurturing the children of the men who'd ordered her son's execution. "You've been watching me," she said. It wasn't a question. All this time, waiting for me to lead you to whatever Danny left behind. We didn't have a choice. Marcus's voice cracked on the words. "You think we wanted this? You think we wanted to spend our high school years pretending to care about some dead kid's mother?" The casual cruelty of it, some dead kid, hit Margaret like a physical blow. But underneath Marcus's words, she heard something else. Fear. Not just of consequences, but of something more immediate and dangerous. They sent you, she realized. Your fathers. They sent their own children to manipulate a grieving mother. "They sent us because we were the only ones you wouldn't suspect," Jasmine said. "Because who would think that 3 struggling students could be anything more than what they appeared?" Margaret thought about all the times she'd worried about these kids the night she'd lain awake wondering if Darius had enough food at home, if Jasmine was safe walking to school alone, if Marcus's frequent absences meant he was falling through the cracks of a system that had already failed too many children. The system hadn't failed them. They'd been working it from the beginning. "The $50,000, she said slowly, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "It was never ransom money. You already know where Danny's records are, don't you?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "You've known this whole time," Margaret continued, her voice growing steadier as the full scope of their deception became clear. "You're not here for information. You're here for something else entirely." Darius met her gaze, and for just a moment, she saw something that might have been genuine regret flicker across his features. Then it was gone, replaced by the hard calculation she now realized had been there all along. "We're here because the statute of limitations runs out in 6 months, he said, "and because our fathers are tired of looking over their shoulders." Margaret felt the last piece of the puzzle click into place with terrible clarity. They weren't here to find Danny's evidence. They were here to make sure it disappeared forever. And they were here to make sure she did too. The weight of their true purpose settled over the classroom like a shroud. Margaret found herself calculating distances, to the door, to her desk phone, to the window that led to a 20-foot drop onto concrete. Every survival instinct Danny had tried to teach her during those last paranoid weeks was suddenly screaming. "You're going to kill me." The words came out matter-of-fact, almost conversational. 3 years of grief had burned away most of her capacity for surprise. "We don't want to," Jasmine said, and the tremor in her voice suggested she might actually mean it. "But our families—" "Your families murdered my son." Margaret's voice cut through whatever justification Jasmine had been building. "And now they've sent their children to finish what they started." Marcus flinched as if she'd struck him. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Danny was supposed to just walk away, disappear. The meeting that night was supposed to be negotiation. But Danny wouldn't listen, Darius added, his father's hardness creeping into his teenage features. He thought he could bargain with people who don't bargain. Thought his evidence would protect him instead of signing his death warrant. Margaret pressed her palms against her desk, feeling the familiar grooves worn by years of students' pencils. How many conversations had she had in this room about choices and consequences? How many times had she told troubled kids that they could rise above their circumstances, that the cycle of violence could be broken? She'd been teaching the cycle's next generation. "The books," she said. "You need me to tell you which ones he took." "We know which ones," Marcus said quietly. "We've known for 2 years. We just couldn't get to them." The admission hit her like cold water. "You've been in my house." "Twice," Darius confirmed. "But you moved them after the second break-in." Smart. Margaret remembered those break-ins, how nothing valuable had been taken, how the police had dismissed them as kids looking for drug money. She'd moved Danny's books to her safety deposit box after the second incident. Some maternal instinct she couldn't name driving her to protect the last pieces of her son's childhood. Those same pieces that contained evidence worth killing for. "What makes you think I'll help you?" she asked. "What makes you think I won't walk out of here and go straight to the FBI?" The three students exchanged glances, and Margaret saw her death sentence in their silent communication. They'd moved past the point where her cooperation mattered. They'd moved past the point where any of them had choices. "Because," Jasmine said, her voice barely above a whisper, "if you don't help us, our fathers will kill our families too." The words rearranged everything Margaret thought she understood about the situation. She stared at Jasmine, this girl she'd watched grow from a sullen freshman into someone who wrote poetry about hope, and saw the truth behind 2 years of carefully maintained deception. "You're not here by choice," Margaret said slowly. "You're here because they're using you the same way they used Danny." "Different game, same rules," Marcus said. His laugh held no humor. "Get close to the target, extract the information, clean up the loose ends. And if you fail, then we become loose ends too." Darius's voice was steady, but Margaret caught the slight tremor in his hands. 3 dead kids from broken homes. Just another statistic in a city full of them. The calculation was breathtaking in its cruelty. These children's fathers had sent them to manipulate a grieving mother, knowing that failure meant death for their own offspring. It was a level of coldness that made Margaret's chest ache with something beyond grief. "How long have you known?" she asked. "How long have you known you were going to have to kill me?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun already fired. Outside, the afternoon was dying, casting long shadows across the empty hallways of Lincoln High. Soon the janitors would start their rounds, but they never bothered with Margaret's classroom until after 6. Whatever was going to happen would be long over by then. "Since yesterday," Marcus admitted, "when our fathers realized the statute of limitations deadline was real, when they stopped believing there was time for subtle approaches." "Yesterday," Margaret repeated. "The same day you asked me for help with the fake kidnapping." "That was real," Jasmine said urgently. "Or it was supposed to be. We were trying to find another way, something that would get you away from here without murdering me in my own classroom," Margaret finished. How considerate. But even as she spoke the words, Margaret found herself studying these children, because that's what they were, despite everything they'd done and been forced to do. Kids caught in the same web that had destroyed Danny, wielding weapons they didn't fully understand against an enemy who should have been their protector. Danny's killers had sent their own children to finish what they'd started, and those children were just as trapped as Danny had been. The realization changed nothing about her situation, but it changed everything about what she was willing to do next. Margaret reached into her desk drawer and withdrew the small digital recorder she'd been using to document her thoughts for Danny's memorial book. The device was older, reliable, the kind that stored files locally rather than in some cloud that could be accessed by others. "I've been recording this conversation," she said, holding up the device. "Every word since you walked in here today." The 3 students froze, their carefully maintained control cracking for the first time. Darius stepped forward, hand outstretched, but Margaret closed her fingers around the recorder. "Mrs. Holloway," Jasmine began. "Margaret," she corrected, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "If we're going to discuss murdering me, we should probably move past formalities." She stood slowly, feeling every one of her 58 years in the movement. But there was something else in the motion, a kind of strength she'd forgotten she possessed. The same strength that had carried her through Danny's funeral, through the endless police interviews, through 3 years of walking into this building every day knowing the system had failed her son. "You want to know something interesting about grief?" she asked, moving around the desk to stand directly in front of them. "It burns away everything unnecessary. Fear, mostly. When you've already lost everything that matters, threats become almost abstract." Marcus's hand moved toward his jacket pocket, the same jacket he'd worn all semester, bulky despite the warming weather. Margaret had attributed it to teenage fashion sense. Now she understood it had been concealing something deadlier than poor style choices. "Don't," she said quietly. "Not yet. Because I have something you need more than you need me dead." "The safety deposit box key," Darius said. "Better." Margaret smiled, and it felt strange on her face, the first genuine expression she'd managed in months. "I have a letter, written in Danny's handwriting, notarized 2 weeks before he died. A letter that explains everything he discovered, everything he recorded, and where additional copies of his evidence are hidden." The lie came easily, built on a foundation of 3 years' worth of imagined conversations with her dead son. But Margaret delivered it with the same conviction she'd used to teach Shakespeare to disinterested teenagers. "That's impossible," Marcus said, but his voice lacked certainty. "Is it?" Danny was paranoid those last few weeks, talking about insurance policies, about making sure the truth would come out if anything happened to him. "You think a boy smart enough to document years of corruption wouldn't be smart enough to protect himself?" Margaret watched their faces, saw doubt creep across features that had been hard with certainty moments before. These were teenagers, despite everything they'd been forced to become. They wanted to believe in safety nets, in backup plans, in the possibility that someone as young as Danny could outsmart the adults trying to destroy him. "Where is it?" Jasmine whispered. "Safe, and scheduled to be opened by federal authorities if I don't check in with specific people at specific times." Margaret met each of their gazes in turn. "People who know exactly who you are, where you live, and what your fathers did to my son." The second lie felt heavier than the first, weighted with the gravity of what she was really telling them. That their careful manipulation had been turned back on itself. That the grieving mother they'd been sent to eliminate had become the architect of their destruction. But Margaret wasn't finished. "Here's what's going to happen," she continued, her voice taking on the authority she'd used to control unruly classrooms for 3 decades. "You're going to walk out of this building and disappear, tonight, all 3 of you, because in exactly 24 hours, I'm going to give the FBI everything Danny left behind, along with 2 years' worth of recordings documenting your confessions. We'll be dead before morning," Darius said flatly. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "If you go home, if you report back to your fathers, if you continue being their weapons instead of their victims." She pulled 3 envelopes from her desk drawer, the college recommendation letters she'd been writing for each of them, back when she'd believed their academic struggles were genuine. Now she offered them like lifelines. Bus tickets to 3 different cities, cash, new identities. Danny's FBI contacts helped me establish. The third lie came wrapped in the kind of hope she'd forgotten how to feel. "The choice your fathers never gave you, and the choice they never gave my son." Margaret stepped back, leaving the envelopes on her desk between them like an offering. Outside, the shadows had grown longer, and she could hear the distant sound of the janitor's cart beginning its evening rounds. "You have 10 minutes to decide," she said. "Choose to remain weapons in someone else's war, or choose to become the children you should have been allowed to be." Then Margaret Holloway, who had spent 3 years teaching the children of her son's killers, walked to her classroom door and waited to see which version of themselves they would choose to become. The silence stretched for exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Margaret knew because she'd been watching the classroom clock, the same industrial timepiece that had marked the minutes of 1,000 ordinary days, back when her biggest concern was whether Marcus would remember to bring his essay or if Jasmine would skip again. Darius moved first. His hand trembled as he reached for the envelope with his name written in Margaret's careful script. The recommendation letter she'd crafted for a boy she'd believed was struggling with anger issues, not carrying the weight of his father's empire. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, and his voice cracked like a child's. "I never wanted—" "I know." The words came easier than she'd expected. "None of you did." Jasmine grabbed her envelope next, clutching it against her chest as tears she'd been fighting for 2 years finally spilled over. "We tried so hard to hate you," she whispered. "It would have made this easier." Marcus hesitated longest, staring at his envelope as if it contained salvation he didn't deserve. When he finally picked it up, his shoulders shook with silent sobs. He was trying to get out too, wasn't he? Danny, just like us. "Yes." Margaret's throat tightened around the word. He was 19 years old, and trying to find a way out of something that wasn't his choice to begin with. She watched them process this, 3 children recognizing themselves in her dead son's story. The symmetry was brutal in its perfection. Danny had been exactly their age when he'd realized the system wouldn't let him go, when he'd started collecting evidence, making plans, believing naively that exposure would equal freedom. "The letter you mentioned," Darius said quietly. "The one Danny wrote. Does it really exist?" Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Does it matter?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither side was quite ready to cross. Because they all knew the real truth, that Margaret Holloway, remedial English teacher and grieving mother, had just outmaneuvered 3 trained killers using nothing but words and the kind of desperate love that had survived its own object. 24 hours, Jasmine said, testing the weight of the promise. 24 hours, Margaret confirmed. Long enough to disappear, not long enough for your fathers to track you down and drag you back. They moved toward the door with the careful coordination of prey animals fleeing a predator's territory. But at the threshold, Marcus turned back. "What about you?" he asked. "When they realize we're gone, when they figure out what happened, let me worry about that." Margaret's smile was sharp-edged and strange. "I've been dead for 3 years already. Now I finally have a reason to live long enough to finish something." After they left, Margaret sat alone in her classroom for another hour, watching the sun die beyond the grimy windows of Lincoln High. The motivational posters on her walls, "Persistence pays off, every child matters, education is the key to success," seemed to mock the conversation that had just ended. But for the first time since Danny's funeral, Margaret felt something other than grief. Not peace exactly, but a sense of completion that had been missing from every day of the last 3 years. She walked to her desk and opened the bottom drawer, withdrawing a manila envelope she'd hidden beneath old grade books. Inside were copies of everything: bank statements Danny had photographed, recorded conversations he'd managed to capture, documentation of a corruption network that reached from street corners to City Hall. The letter she'd mentioned didn't exist. Danny's FBI contacts were figments of maternal imagination. The new identities were bus tickets and $300 she'd withdrawn from her retirement account that morning, driven by an instinct she hadn't fully understood until this moment. But the evidence was real. Danny had been smart enough, careful enough, and paranoid enough to document everything. He just hadn't been experienced enough to know that evidence without powerful allies was just another way to paint a target on your back. Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized 3 years ago but never had the courage to call. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Agent Morrison." "This is Margaret Holloway," she said. "I think it's time we had a conversation about my son." Outside, 3 teenagers were boarding buses to 3 different cities, carrying envelopes full of hope and lies in equal measure. Behind them, the city that had made killers of children and victims of parents continued its slow rotation toward another violent dawn. But in room 247 of Lincoln High School, a remedial English teacher sat in the gathering darkness, finally ready to write the ending her son's story had always deserved. The last lesson had been taught. The final grade was about to be recorded, and Margaret Holloway was no longer just a grieving mother. She was a woman with nothing left to lose and everything necessary to win.